Okay, so you want to own a podcast network. You listen to podcasts constantly? Joe Rogan is making $100 million. Mark Maron's WTF has massive audience. True crime podcasts are generating millions in sponsorships. The podcast industry generates over $2 billion annually in advertising. Spotify paid $100 million for exclusive rights to Joe Rogan. Apple Podcasts are mainstream. Millions of people listen daily. The market seems enormous. You think about launching a network. You'll sign podcasts. You'll aggregate audiences. You'll sell advertising. You'll take a commission. It sounds like owning a content distribution platform that prints money through sponsorships. It sounds like owning a podcast network in 2018 when podcasting was booming, when venture capital was pouring billions into the space, when Spotify and Apple were competing aggressively for content, and when anyone with marketing savvy could theoretically build the next Spotify for podcasting. That is exactly the comparison people are making right now. The podcast industry is absolutely massive. There are over 3 million podcasts in existence. Over 500 million people listen to podcasts monthly globally. The advertising market is growing 15% to 20% annually. Major media companies are investing in podcasts. YouTube is making podcasting easy. TikTok is hosting audio content. The demand is real. The opportunity seems obvious. But here's what is actually happening on the ground, inside podcast networks when the cameras are off and the actual revenue and expenses are analyzed. The reality of owning a podcast network is completely different from what the macro market statistics suggest. Some networks are making money. Most are barely surviving. And 99% of individual podcasts make exactly $0. The gap between the few who generate revenue and the vast majority who don't comes down to a handful of things that almost nobody explains before you invest in infrastructure, talent recruitment, and distribution. By the end of this, you will know exactly where the money actually comes from in podcasting, where it disappears to, why 99% of podcasts make nothing, and what separates the podcast networks that thrive from the ones that become content graveyards consuming capital relentlessly. What a podcast network actually sells. The distribution illusion. People assume that owning a podcast network means you're selling podcasting infrastructure and distribution. You are. But that's not where the money comes from. If you're just providing hosting and distribution, the margins are thin and commoditized. What a podcast network actually sells is access to audiences and advertising inventory. The value is only created when you have massive audiences and can monetize their attention through sponsorships. But here's the brutal truth that nobody discusses openly. 99% of podcasts never achieve meaningful audiences. A podcast needs 1,000 to 5,000 listeners per episode to be attractive to sponsors. Most podcasts have 50 to 200 listeners per episode. They generate $0. They will never generate revenue. The creators invest hundreds of hours and earn nothing. But here's where the economics turn brutal. A podcast network's value is entirely determined by the top 1% of its creators. If you have 10,000 podcasts in your network and 100 of them have real audiences, your network value is determined by those 100 shows. The other 9,900 are noise. They consume infrastructure but generate no revenue. The most successful podcast networks, like Spotify Studios, SiriusXM Podcasts, iHeartMedia, own the top shows. They didn't acquire them by signing unknown podcasters. They bought established shows or signed creators with existing massive audiences. This is how the economics actually work. You need the stars, not the wannabes. The full upfront investment, what actually costs money. Everyone talks about podcasting being free to start. That's true for individuals. It's not true for networks. Hosting and distribution infrastructure, $50,000 to $500,000 podcast hosting platforms cost money. You can use Podbean, Buzzsprout, or Anchor for cheap. Or you can build proprietary infrastructure. A custom hosting platform with analytics, distribution, and monetization costs $100,000 to $500,000 to build. You need servers, bandwidth, CDN infrastructure. Cost, $50,000 to $500,000. Distribution partnerships, $100,000 to $1 million. Getting podcasts on every major platform requires relationships and sometimes money. Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon, they all have discovery and curation requirements. Some require minimum content quality or exclusivity deals that require upfront investment. Cost: $100,000 to $1 million depending on ambitions. Content production and talent: $500,000 to $5 million if you're creating original content rather than just aggregating. You need producers, engineers, and creators. A single podcaster might cost $50,000 to $150,000 per year all in. If you're funding 10 to 20 original shows, that's $500,000 to $3 million annually. Cost: $500,000 to $5 million. Marketing and creator recruitment: $200,000 to $2 million you need to recruit creators to your network. This requires marketing, partnerships, and often financial incentives. A revenue share isn't enough for established creators. You might need to offer $50,000 to $500,000 signing bonuses to attract talent. Cost: $200,000 to $2 million. Technology and software: $100,000 to $500,000 analytics platforms. Audience management. Ad insertion software. Dynamic insertion for multiple sponsors. Cost: $100,000 to $500,000. Advertising sales team: $300,000 to $1 million you need people selling advertising to brands. Salespeople, ad ops specialists, account managers. Cost: $300,000 to $1 million annually. Legal and licensing: $50,000 to $200,000 music licensing for podcast intros and outros. Creator agreements. Terms of service. Legal consultation. Cost: $50,000 to $200,000. Working capital and operating buffer: $200,000 to $1 million money to cover operations during ramp-up period while building audience and sponsorships. Cost: $200,000 to $1 million. The real total investment: for a legitimate podcast network with original content and distribution ambitions, the total upfront investment is $1.5 million to $10 million depending on scope. Most networks are venture-backed because individual capital can't sustain the burn rate. Where the money actually comes from: the revenue model that doesn't work for most podcasts. Revenue model is theoretically simple. CPM-based sponsorships. CPM, cost per thousand, for podcast advertising, $18 to $50 depending on audience quality and niche. 100,000 listeners per episode times $30 CPM equals $3,000 per episode. Weekly show: $12,000 per month or $144,000 per year. Simple math. But here's the brutal reality. The actual revenue distribution: top 1% of podcasts, 1,000 shows with 100,000 plus listeners. Revenue: $12,000 to $100,000 plus per month. These shows support themselves and the network. Top 5% of podcasts, 15,000 shows with 10,000 plus listeners. Revenue: $1,000 to $10,000 per month. These shows are sustainable but not lucrative. Top 10% of podcasts, 30,000 shows with 1,000 plus listeners. Revenue: $100 to $1,000 per month. These shows barely cover expenses. Bottom 90% of podcasts, 2,700,000 shows. Revenue: $0. These shows generate $0. What a podcast network owner doesn't account for: the brutal math. Audience building requires massive time. A successful podcast takes 2 to 3 years to reach 50,000 monthly listeners. Most creators give up within 6 months when they have 500 listeners. The retention rate is below 5%. You're spending $50,000 to $150,000 per year on a show that might never reach monetizable scale. Listener decay: a show with 100,000 listeners can lose 30% to 50% of audience over 6 months if quality declines or posting frequency slows. Building an audience is harder than maintaining one, and maintaining one is harder than podcasting assumes. Sponsorship rates are collapsing. CPMs were $30 to $50 per thousand 5 years ago. Today, they're $15 to $30 for most podcasts. As the podcast market saturated, advertising rates dropped. A show with 50,000 listeners that would have earned $1,500 per episode 5 years ago now earns $750 to $1,000. Revenue halved. Apple Podcasts doesn't monetize. Apple has 50 million podcast listeners but doesn't run ads on most shows. Spotify is gradually adding ads but slowly. Most podcast revenue still comes from direct sponsorship, which requires manual sales effort. Passive monetization at scale doesn't exist. Creator churn is massive. A creator signs with your network. They get 5% to 10% of sponsorship revenue. You take 90% to 95%. The creator thinks they're not getting paid enough. They leave for another platform or try to sell sponsorships directly. Your network loses the show and the relationship. The monthly economics of a podcast network. A network with 100 shows. 10 shows with 100,000 plus listeners. 20 shows with 10,000 plus listeners. 30 shows with 1,000 plus listeners. 40 shows with under 1,000 listeners. Revenue from sponsorships. 10 shows times 4 episodes / month times 100,000 listeners times $25 CPM equals $100,000. 20 shows times 4 episodes / month times 10,000 listeners times $25 CPM equals $20,000. 30 shows times 4 episodes / month times 1,000 listeners times $25 CPM equals $3,000. 40 shows times $0 equals $0. Total monthly revenue $123,000. Total annual revenue $1.476 million. Now the costs: infrastructure and hosting, monthly $15,000, content production, 10 original shows, $150,000, creator payouts, creator revenue split, $61,500, advertising sales team, salaries, $100,000, marketing and recruitment, $50,000, technology and software, $30,000, legal and licensing, $10,000, administrative and other, $20,000, total monthly operating costs, $436,500, operating loss, $313,500, annual operating loss, $3,762,000, a podcast network generating $1.476 million. In revenue is losing $3.762 million annually. The model is deeply unprofitable. What kills podcast network economics? The creator revenue share paradox. If you take 90% commission, creators hate you and leave. If you take 50%, you're barely covering overhead. Most networks take 30% to 50% and still lose money because overhead is high. Venture capital burn. Networks are venture-backed. They raise $10 million to $50 million. They burn $3 million to $5 million annually. They last 5 to 7 years before capital runs out. By then, they need to be profitable or get acquired. Most don't achieve profitability. Spotify and Apple dominance. Spotify and Apple control distribution and audience data. Networks have limited leverage. Spotify can feature shows they want. Apple can bury shows they don't. This power imbalance means networks can't control their own destiny. Audio is hard to monetize. Podcasts don't have visual advertising. Video ad rates are higher because engagement is higher. Audio is background noise for most listeners. Attentional value is lower. CPM rates reflect this. The podcast network that actually works: you launch a network focused on one vertical. Business podcasts. True crime. Sports. Your shows have overlapping audiences. You can sell sponsorships across multiple shows simultaneously, increasing scale. You build exclusive partnerships with platforms. You incentivize audience growth through revenue sharing. You reach profitability with 200 plus shows generating $10,000 to $100,000 monthly in sponsorships. Your overhead is distributed across massive revenue base. You achieve 20% to 30% net margins. Alternatively, you acquire established shows with existing audiences. You don't build from zero. You buy Gimlet, Pushkin, or other successful networks. You leverage existing audiences immediately. You cut costs aggressively. You achieve profitability through consolidation. The bad scenario: the more common outcome. You launch a podcast network with $5 million in venture capital. You hire talented producers. You sign 200 podcasters with revenue share agreements. You invest in infrastructure. Year 1, You have 50,000 monthly downloads total across all shows. Revenue is $150,000. Operating costs are $800,000. Loss, $650,000. Year 2, you've reached 200,000 monthly downloads. Revenue, $600,000. Operating costs, $900,000. Loss, $300,000. Year 3, you're at $500,000 monthly downloads. Revenue, $1.5 million. Operating costs, $1 million. You finally break even. Year 4, podcast growth slows. Revenue plateaus. You need growth to attract new capital or justify the investment. You can't achieve it. Investor interest wanes. You're forced to close or sell at a massive loss. Total burned capital, $5 million plus for zero return. The truth nobody discusses: 99% of podcasts make $0 out of 3 million podcasts in existence. Fewer than 30,000 have audiences large enough to be sponsorship attractive. That's 1%. The other 2.97 million are hobbies. They generate zero revenue. They are never going to generate revenue. The creators spend hundreds of hours and earn nothing. This is the brutal reality that nobody discusses when promoting podcasting as a business. The hidden advantage of owned intellectual property: the networks that win are the ones that own content. Spotify owns Spotify Studios shows. SiriusXM owns SiriusXM podcast shows. They control the content, the distribution, and the monetization. They don't need to recruit external creators or take revenue splits. They own everything. This model works. The aggregator model, where you recruit other people's podcasts and take a cut, doesn't work because the upside is limited and overhead is high. Conclusion: the actual economics of podcast networks. Owning a podcast network is a capital-intensive content business with massive overhead, collapsing monetization rates, and structural challenges to profitability. Most networks lose money continuously and require venture capital to survive. 99% of podcasts generate $0 in revenue. The money in podcasting goes to three groups. First, the top 1% of creators with massive audiences who can sell sponsorships directly or negotiate exclusive deals with platforms. Second, platforms like Spotify and Apple who control distribution and monetization. Third, venture capital firms funding the networks that eventually fail or get acquired. The separation between networks that survive and those that fail comes down to three factors: owned intellectual property instead of reliant on external creators, massive scale enabling unit economics to work, strategic platform partnerships that guarantee distribution. A podcast network built on aggregating other people's shows and taking revenue splits will almost certainly fail. The margins are too thin. The overhead is too high. Creator retention is too low. You're competing with direct sponsorship sales where creators keep 100%. You can't win that game. A podcast network built on creating original content and owning the intellectual property can work if it achieves massive scale. But that requires $10 million to $50 million in capital and 5 to 10 years before profitability. Most individual investors and startups can't support that timeline. Here's the brutal reality that nobody in the podcasting community wants to acknowledge. Podcasting is a hobby for 99% of creators. It's a platform advantage for the platforms themselves. It's a capital-burning venture for networks trying to aggregate creators. The podcast gold rush is over. The easy money went to early creators like Joe Rogan, who could negotiate exclusive multi-million-dollar deals. Everyone else is competing for scraps in a CPM market that's been commoditized to $15 to $30 per thousand. If you're considering launching a podcast network, understand that you're betting against unfavorable economics, massive overhead, low CPMs, and the reality that 99% of creators will never make money. Unless you have $10 million plus in capital and a clear path to owned IP at scale, you're likely to burn capital for years with minimal returns. The podcast network that succeeded was built before CPMs collapsed. The podcast network launching today is starting from a position of structural disadvantage. Proceed with extreme caution.